Good morning. We are privileged for our second presentation during Black History Month to welcome Beverly Willis. Her presentation is entitled Common Threads, an introduction to some local roots of Black history. She will share with us some of the narratives and images of African American history and the arts that connect our communities together. Beverly is the administrator for the Washtenaw County Historical Society. She is vice president of the Ann Arbor Historical Foundation, co-chair of the Exhibits and Collections Committee for the African American Cultural and Historic Museum of Washtenaw County, and a member of the African American Endowment Fund. She is also a freelance graphic designer, project consultant, and volunteer for your local organization. Bev has 14 years of experience at the museum on Main Street, developing exhibits, print materials, and digital media to share stories at the heart of the community's heritage. Her passion for history, art, and community service was ignited by her own family's story in the museums, monuments, and parks in Washington, D.C., where she grew up. She attended Howard University in Washington, D.C., and has a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the University of Michigan. And we are really looking forward to hearing from you, Beverly.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here in the room, on Zoom, and those of you who are going to be able to appreciate this presentation at a later time. This is the day that the Lord has made, so let us rejoice and be glad in it. This psalm, for me, has always been a call to action. It is an affirmation. It is an intentional reset to be thankful and joyful every day, because life is truly a gift from God. So I want to thank Helena and Diane for inviting me to be here at First Presbyterian Church today. And I thank all of those who are here with us today as we come together to weave some of the common threads that we all share. If we just take a few minutes to consider the human experience, we would see quite clearly that there are relatively few things that we don't have in common. Each of us is here for a reason, and our mission is to find out what that reason is and do it the best that we can. We are all social beings. We want love. We have a longing to be part of something bigger than ourselves. We want our families to be strong and secure. We want the freedom to live in communities of our choice. And we all want to have fulfilling careers for equitable pay. All humans share the drive to use our imaginations to make something better. And just like this day, this beautiful, snowy, silvery gray day that the Lord has made, on this day and every day after, we have the opportunity. We have the opportunity to do something as an individual to effect change, to be better citizens of the world. The story of Black History Month begins in Chicago during the summer of 1915. An alumnus of the University of Chicago with many friends in the city, Carter G. Woodson traveled from Washington, D.C. to participate in a national celebration of the 50th anniversary of emancipation. Thousands of African Americans traveled from across the country to see exhibits highlighting the progress of our people had made since the destruction of slavery. Woodson was an American historian, author, journalist, and the founder of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. He was one of the first scholars to study the history of the African diaspora, including African American history. In 1924, and this is a picture of the Elijah McCoy exhibit at the 1915 convention. we don't know which one of the men in the picture is Elijah McCoy because we know that his family traveled with him, and one of his brothers was with him on this trip. In 1924, Woodson told an audience of Hampton Institute students that's located in Virginia that we are going back to that beautiful history, and it is going to inspire us to greater achievements. Now, Woodson chose February for reasons of tradition and reform. He selected February to encompass the birthdays of two great Americans who played a prominent role in shaping history, whose birthdays are the 12th and the 14th, respectively, Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And more importantly, he chose them for reasons of tradition. Since Lincoln's assassination in 1865, the Black community, along with other Republicans, have been celebrating the fallen president's birthday. And since the late 1890s, Black communities across the country have been celebrating Douglass's birthday. Well aware of these pre-existing celebrations, Woodson built the first form, Negro History Week, around traditional days commemorating the Black past. In 1975, President Gerald Ford issued a message on the observance of Black History Month, urging all Americans to recognize the important contribution made to our nation's life and culture by Black Americans. And in 1986, Congress passed the public law, officially designating February as National Black History Month. And it would mark the beginning of the 60th annual private and public celebration. So this morning, I'm going to share 5 short stories about local Black history that you may be familiar with. These stories are stepping out of the month of February to join the mainstream of local history as we weave our community's fabric without altering the shape, the size, or the color of the threads. Eva Jesse was born January 20th, 1895 in Coffeyville, Kansas. She was educated at Western University, a historically Black university in Kansas. She was a composer, arranger, writer, poet, actress, and African-American music historian. She was also the first Black woman to be internationally recognized as a professional choral director. Her original Dixie Jubilee Singers, later renamed the Eva Jesse Choir, were popular performers of stage and radio in the 1920s. They toured throughout the United States with a repertoire of spirituals, work songs, mountain ballads, ragtime, jazz, and light opera. The group served as singers in numerous Broadway shows and several motion pictures, and their first movie, Hallelujah, was produced by MGM in 1929, and it broke a major color barrier. Dr. Jesse was the first Black musical director of a film starring Black actors. But in 1935, Jesse became the choral director for the premiere production of George Gershwin's opera, Porgy and Bess. Gershwin specifically sought her out. He knew that the work he was composing needed to have authentic voices in the music and in the message. He was well aware of the talents of Jesse and her group. Jesse toured the United States, Europe, and the Soviet Union and New Zealand, performing Porgy and Bess, and was associated with countless other productions worldwide. For the next 3 decades, in fact, Jesse was associated with almost every Porgy and Bess production, and she actually had the unofficial title given to her by Gershwin of curator and guardian of the score. Now, Jesse acted as an advisor for several television shows. She performed in Hallmark Hall of Fame production, Kiss Me Kate. But in 1963, her choir was designated the official choir of the Civil Rights March on Washington, D.C. Now, Jesse came to the University of Michigan in 1974. With the encouragement of then Dean Willis Patterson, she established the Eva Jesse Afro-American Music Collection at the University of Michigan. She died in 1992 at the age of 94, but she was a woman who changed the face of the cultural arts in America. The daughter of formerly enslaved parents, Eva would stand with Dr. Martin Luther King in Washington, D.C., and teach at the University of Michigan. John Anderson was born and enslaved by the Sullivan family in Sullivan, Missouri. He liberated himself as a young man in the early 1850s. John headed for Canada, but he wound up here in Washtenaw County, first living on the Rowe Farm in Manchester. In 1867, John married Lucy York, and Lucy was born in Ypsilanti to Washington and Sarah York from Kentucky in the 1840s. Her parents were co-founders of Brown Chapel AME Church in Ypsilanti. And the Yorks were among Ypsilanti's earliest black families. Two of their sons, David and George York, fought in the Civil War with John. They joined Company A of the 102nd United States Colored Troops in the last month of the war. So John Anderson participated in Potter's Raid through South Carolina. He himself, a fugitive from enslavement, and his comrades, including his future brother-in-law, David York, helped to liberate thousands of African Americans in April 1865. But on return to Michigan, John and his family had a small farm in Sharon Township before moving back to Ypsilanti. They lived and raised their 5 children at 303 South Adams for nearly 50 years, just across the street from the Yorks, Lucy's brother, David, and his family. And the Andersons contributed greatly to the building of Ypsilanti. Lucy and John's son, Fred Anderson, was the early president of the Ypsilanti chapter of the NAACP in the 1910s. Now Martha Array Day, the owner of a cider mill that once stood in the middle of the road. She was not only a woman, and she was not only African-American woman, but she's believed to be one of the few documented black business owners at that time in the trade of cider. The mill was located at Michigan Avenue in Pittsfield Township. It had a 10-year run between 1880 and 1899, and the mill made approximately 1,500 barrels of cider in a season. But in June of 1899, Martha and her neighbor John Sullivan sued Pittsfield Township because the Ypsilanti and Saline Electric Railway were building a road. And the road that they wanted to build for their train track cut right through their cider mill and their property, too close to both of their properties, impeding their production. But 1899 is like any other year, any other time. Progress is not stopped. They lost the lawsuit, but they retained their property. And Martha's parents came to the area in 1827. Her grandparents came to the area in 1827. They purchased 160 acres, were successful farmers in Pittsfield Township, and one of the first black families in Washtenaw County. Now their son Asher was Martha's father. And Asher Array and his wife Catherine used their farm as a station on the Underground Railroad. In the years before the Civil War, they worked independently and collectively with their white neighbors, Roswell Preston Jr. and William Harwood. And they worked together to transport, shelter African Americans seeking freedom in Canada. While Michigan was a free state, people who were fleeing that oppression from the South didn't quite feel safe until they crossed the river into Canada. There's even a story on one occasion where Asher sheltered 28 freedom seekers for a day on his farm before transporting them to Detroit overnight, the last stop before crossing the river to Canada. And that was a story that was documented in the Detroit Free Press, not only because of the number of people that were helped that time, but because of the intense journey that they had taken from leaving the state of Kentucky. So we're very fortunate in this town. We have some great historians and writers. And local author and historian Grace Shackman wrote that the First Presbyterian Church was organized in 1826, just 2 years after Ann Arbor was founded. The original 17 members included co-founder John Allen and his wife and parents. And in the first 3 years, the group met wherever they could find space, in a log schoolhouse, in 2 different taverns, in an unfinished room in Cook's Hotel, and in a frame schoolhouse. But in 1829, and that's this picture, they built their own modest frame building at Huron and Division. In 1837, your church moved into a bigger church down the street. But in 1859, the original site was repurchased, and work began on a more permanent red brick church. Finished in 1862, it was used almost for 75 years. And what's specifically important about this church is that it was the place where the first meeting was held of the Michigan Anti-Slavery Society, which was founded on November 10th in 1836. And the founding of this anti-slavery society was a part of a movement to abolish slavery in several states during the 1830s, as well as provide support for those within the territory who were helping with the Underground Railroad. And these society meetings were held at the First Presbyterian Church for 10 years. So the church building on East Huron, where those iconic meetings were held, was demolished in 1935. The Albert Kahn designed building at 340 East Huron was home to the Ann Arbor News for more than 70 years, and now is the headquarters for the University of Michigan Credit Union. But there is a historical marker recognizing the significance of this location. And there's also a historical marker at this location where the church honors its place in history with the cornerstone from the original church, and that's what you see there on the right of the screen. Now, the newspaper, the Signal of Liberty, came out of the Michigan Anti-Slavery Society, and it was published by Theodore Foster and Reverend Guy Beckley in April 1841. It managed to go to press almost every week. Now, the printing office was located in the building across the street where Guy Beckley's brother, Josiah Beckley, had a mercantile shop. And it's located right across the street from where Sick Transit Cycles currently is. So it's the building across the street. It's no longer there, but it was across the street. They worked tirelessly to promote the newspaper. Theodore Foster was co-editor until 1848. Now, the Signal of Liberty newspapers are online at the Ann Arbor District Library, an amazing resource that we have in our community. It's one more thing I wanted to say about that. There was an article in the January 2021 Observer written by a young man named Dave McCormick about the Signal of Liberty. Now, when you live in a town for a long time, we are familiar with stories. We think we know the story. We don't have to read it again. We don't want to hear it again. Please don't tell it again. So I'm really always excited to see somebody come and say, do you know about this? And my answer is always no. You know, well, what is it? Tell me. So I had a little time to chat with David to let him know how much we appreciate community of history, seeing new minds and new perspectives and fresh views on a story we're familiar with. And one of the things that he thought was interesting was that this paper had an initial circulation of 500. And by February of the following year, subscriptions had almost doubled to 900. And by the mid-1840s, the circulation doubled again. McCormick's research also showed that 1,200 of Michigan subscribers, out of 1,200 Michigan subscribers, close to 300 of them resided in Washtenaw County, which also provided for half of the newspaper's advertising. And when I look at these papers online and see the large amount of advertising, which part is benevolent, Part is, please come to my place of business and buy my goods. So we understand why they advertise. But you look at those advertisers, and in relation to the occupations, approximately 60% were farmers. And he wondered why. And the theory that Dave came up with is that one of the reasons that these groups supported the abolition of slavery is because they believed that their own hard work had brought them the financial success that they were then enjoying, and that nobody should be barred from that same opportunity. So Dr. Simeon Carson, would you ever imagine that the man who was once called the most brilliant surgeon in Washington, D.C., grew up in Ann Arbor? Dr. Simeon Lewis Carson was raised here, graduating from Ann Arbor schools, including the University of Michigan Medical School, who accepted him into the U of M Medical School at the age of 17. Now, Martin and Harriet Carson, Simeon's parents, were from Marion, North Carolina. They had received a letter from an uncle who was in Ann Arbor, who wrote of all the different type of freedom and educational opportunities that his family had found here. So Martin packed up his 8 children, and with 50 cents in his pocket, he moved to Ann Arbor. And like many people who came to a new place from an old place, black and white, you come where your family is and where your friends are and where you can stay until you get your footing in the community. So he came, he stayed with his uncle, but his skill as a gardener became very well known, and he found permanent employment at the University of Michigan. And Dr. Carson would often, in his talks and in his classes, he would many times proudly state how his father was one of the first to develop the fine green lawns on the University of Michigan campus that the students subsequently trampled and destroyed, but they were there. So now the Carsons lived at 45 Maiden Lane. And when Simeon graduated from the U of M Medical School, he was the first black youth from Ann Arbor to accomplish this. His North Side neighbors, 85% of whom were white, were so proud of him that they presented the doctor with a completely furnished office for him to practice his medicine upon graduation. And he did. He practiced initially in Ann Arbor, but in 1903, he took a competitive examination to obtain a post as a government physician on the Sioux Reservation at Lower Brule, South Dakota. And in 1908, and after doing that job in 1908, he won, over 52 other applicants, the post of Assistant Surgeon Chief at Freedman's Hospital in Washington, D.C. He was only 26. Then in 1919, Dr. Carson opened up the Carson Private Hospital in Washington, D.C., which was one of the first of its kind to be fully directed by a person of color. From 1929 to 1936, he served as a clinical professor of surgery on the faculty of the School of Medicine at Howard University, and he simultaneously continued his private practice until he retired at age 56. But he died at age 72 as a young man in 1954, and 72 is young. So Carson was known for being one of the first surgeons within Washington, D.C. to use spinal anesthesia during surgery. He is also renowned for his skillful use of general anesthesia throughout most of the surgeries he performed over his lifetime. He was one of the earliest surgeons to recognize the impact of anesthesia in a successful operation and outcome and recovery. At one time, he held the world's timed record for the operation of cesarean section, having successfully performed this delicate operation in 14 minutes. But he had to do it. He had to do it to save the life of the mother and the child. As a doctor, as a surgeon, he always believed he had no choice. He collected medical instruments, he worked with local students, and he loved the outdoors. He was an ardent sportsman. The founder and guiding spirit of the Deep Sea Anglers and Hunters Club, he won a number of trophies. But years later, all through Dr. Carson's years, when one would see him leave a fishing boat at the end of any season, he was suddenly thrust into the hands of a young boy, an astonished young boy standing by his fine fishing rod and reel, and purchased another for himself the next year, because it would be clear that he had never forgotten what it was like to be young and poor. This is a professor, University of Michigan professor, Robert Hayden. He was an African-American poet and professor who is best known for his poems, including Those Winter Sundays and The Middle Passage. He served as consultant in poetry to the Library of Congress from 1976 to 1978, a role today we know as U.S. Poet Laureate. He was the first African-American writer to hold the office. Now, Robert Hayden was born in Detroit in 1913. In his youth, he experienced a combination of misfortunes: poverty, his parents' unhappy marriage, his father's violent discipline, being left for others to raise, and severe nearsightedness. Feelings of isolation drew him to books, particularly the works of poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, Langston Hughes, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Carl Sandburg, and Countee Cullen. Now, by the time Hayden graduated from high school in 1930, he had committed himself to becoming a poet. He joined the Federal Writers Project, helping to research Black history and folklore. And in 1938, he left the Federal Writers Project and published his first volume, Heart Shape in the Dust. He enrolled at the University of Michigan in 1941, where he studied under the British poet W.H. Auden and earned his master's degree. In 1942, he taught at Fisk University in Tennessee in the English department, where he remained for 23 years. In 1966, he was awarded the grand prize at the First World Festival of Negro Arts in Dakar, Senegal, and he published several selected poems in the same year. But he returned to teach at the University of Michigan in 1968, and he remained there. In 1970, and that's where he got his first invitation to be the poetry consultant. But the University of Michigan told him he had to turn it down. And the U of M said, you have to turn this down because you are just like any other professor in our institution. You will not have the time to do this. You will be teaching, you'll be working with students, you will be doing the work of an English professor, and this is your job. No problem. But in 1976, when the request came the second time, he accepted. Now, Robert and Emma Hayden's house at 1201 Gardner in Lower Burns Park in Ann Arbor was made an historic district in 2023. The exterior will always look the way it did when his family lived there. They're holding space to keep history alive. And this house, 1201 Gardner, is in the same neighborhood where my in-laws lived in Lower Burns Park for several years. And I would be on the bus, and I would see Robert Hayden on the bus. And I would think, God, how does that guy see anything? And who is he? And what is it about? But that was back in the day where we didn't interrupt people in their private going about the world and ask those type of questions. But I'd heard about the music coming out of his and Emma's house. She was a classically trained pianist who taught music and performed. So there would be students that he taught would come to his house after class and sit and talk about the poems and all the interesting things that those students were interested in. When I finally got a chance to be in the house, and it was after Robert Hayden, long after he had passed away, his daughter had passed away at this time, and his bookshelves, and many people who collect books are like this, but every wall in his house had bookshelves and was lined, and you just didn't see wall, all you saw was books. And he collected books of every type of history, philosophy, cultures, countries, it didn't matter. It was one of the most beautiful, immersive experiences that I think I've ever had in my life. And I learned that we never know who's sitting next to us or who we are sharing time and space with. It's just always important to be ready and to be prepared to be just delightfully impressed. And one of these poems, Those Winter Sundays, is in fact one of the poems that is a very, now I'm probably not going to be able to do this because I wanted to play the, play him reading it, but I don't know how to do this from PowerPoint.
Here comes Bill.
Thank you.
Help is on the way.
Help is on the way. I said many times I'll read it out loud, but I love to hear him say it. See, like that's really a video, but there's not a.
Okay, let's see. So is this a PowerPoint right now? Okay. Let's. Why don't we see what the next slide is? Or just go like that, or we can go back with. With that. Let's click on that. Maybe.
I keep thinking this is my touch screen.
Oh, yeah. Where's our cursor? Let's see. Control. Where is our cursor?
That's okay. I'll read it.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. No, that's okay. And it's so funny because I do so much technology stuff, and I've just come off a week of it. So I'm like, oh, but this isn't even my computer, so I've just. So I think I will just go ahead and read it to you because it. I've listened to him read it so many times that I think I can capture his, because my Sundays were not like this. My Sundays are absolutely beautiful and filled with family and post-church and the smell of dinner cooking, and that my dad was doing it to give my mom a break, who managed to do it 6 days out of the week for people who inhaled it as a memory by the time she put it on the table. So my Sundays and my family life is very filled with love. But this is Robert's. Those winter Sundays, Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? So powerful. It just impacts us in a way that you think about winter Sundays. Just those two words can also paint an image of peace and reflection and joyful expectation. So we need to be sure to take in all of the beautiful things of life. Be sure to take in that beautiful art exhibit, Community Perspectives on Social Change, a view from our world, that is in the room downstairs. When I went through it, looking at each piece inspired me to think about the view from my world by seeing it through someone else's eyes. So how do we build bridges and connections that allow us to become better citizens of the world? We can practice kindness, we can cultivate compassion, and we can love. And that means to be actively engaged in acts of kindness and care toward others, to intentionally develop empathy and understanding of others' experiences, and to embrace a deep feeling of care and affection for ourselves and those around us. And that allows us to bring a positive and caring mindset in our interactions with the world. So I am so grateful that I had this opportunity to share these stories and this slice of life from our community, and look forward to being able to see you guys moving through the week and the days ahead, and just embrace this moment that we had together. I'm just so grateful for that today. So thank you. Thank you. Any questions?
That there many of us here who might have questions. I will start out by asking you if you will share a little bit about the African American History Museum. And I understand that it has a new home now.
Yes.
And maybe you could share a little bit about that with us.
Sure. The African American Cultural and Historical Museum was established in 1993 and has had a couple of locations, being at 1528 Pontiac Trail for 3 years, where we had a wonderful chance to get exhibits and start building community and awareness about the organization. And then just last year, we're able to move into the David R. Byrd Center, which is Letitia Byrd's vision that she had when her husband David Byrd purchased the farmhouse back in the 80s. He was a professor of construction at Washtenaw Community College. And he purchased that house to be a laboratory to help students learn the different building trades, because he believed that women and minorities were just underrepresented in this field. So they worked on that house, and they also built at the same time a cupola, that little round top of the church in the basement. And once the cupola was finished, Byrd decided that a church needed to belong under it. So that's when they built the church that lies beyond the David R. Byrd Center, the Episcopal Church of the Incarnation. And he specifically chose the cinder block to use as a building because that is the stone that the builders rejected. And probably that's the stone that many of us have at the bottom of our feet. You know? So this museum is open Saturday and Sunday from 12 to 4 and weekdays by appointment. It's hugely ambitious. It's established in a historic district. And the reason why it was established as a historic district is because that farmhouse has history that goes back to Pittsfield Township in the 1820s and the 1830s. And those of us who work in history know that we operate in silos. And that's very nice and convenient. But if anybody knows anybody who's under the age of 35, you will know that this is a generation that does not operate in silos. This is a generation that welcomes difference, diversity. They embrace each other, they love for each other, they care for each other in a way that many other generations just didn't. And so they look at history, they want to see the combined picture. If it's going to be separated, let them be the ones to pull the wheat from the chaff, or whatever the expression is, but they want to see the combined story. So we feel it's important, and you'll see this on on Laura Road, you will see this at the museum on Main Street, you will see this at Cobblestone Farm, you will see this at Kemp House. Our goal is to incorporate as much community history in the greater narrative and do this intentionally and with purpose. We learned this from the bicentennial. If you're going to tell a story that you want to tell, you need to start writing the chapters so that they will be read when it's time to read what we did in a way that we want it to be received. So the African American Museum is so happy that it's opened, and hope that everybody supports not only that museum, but all of our local historical museums. Ann Arbor District Library, Ypsilanti District Library, every single one of them is just a gem and an asset to our community. And they really count on us. We really count on you coming through our front doors.
Thank you.
Yes.
Anybody else have any questions?
My husband always thought that Elijah McCoy was from Ypsilanti. Is that true?
It is true.
Yeah.
Yeah, he lived in lots of different places. He was actually educated in Scotland because he wanted to study engineering. And Elijah McCoy's family has so many stories and pieces of history in this area. I think about him as an inventor. He's mostly known for the lubricating cup, but he has so many other types of inventions. But he was a frustrated young engineer was certain that he was kept from advancing due to his color. But that never stopped him from doing the work of his trade. And he did not contrast himself to Robert Pelham. Robert Pelham was the African-American architect who built those railroad bridges. And he's the one who built the railroad arch, the skewed arch bridge in Dexter, the one that trucks and everything continues to get stuck under. He also had a difficult time finding employment in the railroads because of the color of his skin, but still persevered to follow his passion. And I think that's the lesson that the people who have had those experiences bring to us, whether it's people of color who struggle to find a place, or women who struggle to get the job, or whatever it is. You know, we just have to really support each other and just see through beautiful, fresh eyes what is before us.
First, I just want to say thank you. You did such a lovely job of both telling the stories of folks from other parts of the world who ended up here in Washtenaw County, and then the people who started here in Washtenaw County and ended up influencing the rest of the world. Really, really nice. I have a very, very specific question,
Yes.
and you may not know the answer, and that's fine. But I was gazing at that picture of Simeon Carson's own hospital
Yes.
in D.C., and I wondered what part of D.C. that was in, if you know.
Well, you know, I could look at, because I did grow up there. Let me see what the address is. Sometimes on these things, you can't really see the text as clearly. Does it say? Actually, it falls below the part where it's, you know. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of, like, I don't want to say Lafayette Circle, but like,
Looks like Northwest.
it looks like Northwest. It feels like Northwest. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And it was one of those questions that every time I do something like this, and I know each slide is the presentation, each image is a story. And when we do history and we do work, we try to put it all together, and so people can walk out with this big understanding. But each story is a talk. Yeah.
I know you'll know the background, but I don't know how much you want to share in this. One of the things is that I see as a change in the history of the African American citizens in Ann Arbor is what took place in 1960.
Yes.
When we had community, when we lost Jones School, and that whole community was really the residence for black people.
Yes.
And was limited to
Yes,
that, and
yes.
how that impacted the population of people people of color, especially black people in our community.
We're at the doorstep of that history. And I say that because there was a large group of teachers that were brought in from the South, black teachers that were brought from the South to teach in the Ann Arbor public schools in the 60s and the 70s. And when you bring in a group of people with a different perspective, it kind of tends to upset the apple cart of those who have been entrenched. But the new people don't really care. It's not that they don't care, but they're brought here to do a purpose. And that was also at the beginning of realizing the unequal education levels and the gaps in the learning and all that sort of stuff. I am really encouraging people to look at the 50s and the 60s, because we can't learn any more about, well, we could always learn more about 1890. But in order for history to stay alive and be meaningful and relevant, we have to hit the people's area of interest where they're at. And so people are really curious about the 60s. And as we look at buildings going away, or as people feel like, oh, our neighborhoods are leaving, this is being torn down, there's no longer a memory. We did a bus tour with mayor, police chief, different officials from Ann Arbor to go through traditionally black neighborhoods in the Ann Arbor area. And I am always a marketing cheerleader kind of person. So if somebody has a role, I'm like, okay, now it's your moment. So we were by DeLong's, where DeLong's used to be. And Bob's daughter was the owner of DeLong's was on the trip. And we wanted her to speak about DeLong's and what it meant and all that. She was so overcome with emotion. She couldn't get the words out. And she just started crying, looking at that big building that's going up and knowing that once her father's barbecue stand was there. So after the journey, I said to her, Diana, we've got to figure out a way for you to articulate the emotion of what that meant, because this building is up. You know, and most of the people who really live here may not have ever eaten at DeLong's or know that. So we have got to find a way to tell that part of the story, but bring it to the forefront. So we like to say, communities change, people change, things change, but history remains the same. So telling that story, because it was very brave of those teachers and those academic professionals to face that problem and meet that challenge. Because you're not only dealing with the gap in education, you're bringing a big culture mix. And my family's from North Carolina. So I know what it's like to bring the South to the North. And it is not always easy. But our school system has definitely got a lot of history. So we're looking at the 1950s. 1950 census is just recently really available. And I can almost say there's not a person who doesn't have a connection to the 50s. If you weren't born in it, or raised in it, or living in it, or recently departed from it, you know, there's a 50s connection. And so we're sort of starting there and leading into the 60s and the 70s. Because our young people want to know the history that we haven't really been fully ready to tell. And part of that is because so many people are still living. You know, there's a local history book series called Arcadia Publishing. And they love people writing books, but they encourage you, don't write about anybody who's still alive. Because they'll always say, this isn't how it was, this isn't what it was. But we live a long time these days. And many times the people who are the keeper of the stories and the livers of the experience are still here. So to get that thank you. Without changing their narrative or taking the responsibility for making it happy or sad. Just let them tell their story and find ways to share that with others who are interested in that history. They say that we interpret history at museums. That's what we do with exhibits. We interpret history. Yet we tell people to come in and look at it and interpret it for yourself. It's the same with this art exhibit downstairs. Brad was quite great in saying, you know, we don't have the answers, but these are some of the questions that this artwork might address. And it's like when your teacher used to tell you, do your own work. You know, be original. Don't look at your neighbor's work. Do your own work. And for people who come up in the era of searching the internet, we're not going to say the G word as freely as we used to, because we don't need to give them any advertising. So instead of the G word for the internet, we search the internet for answers. And when you start thinking about how you want your story to be told, how you want to be remembered, it's important for us to listen to those stories and document them so that other people can learn from them. That's what history is. And we leave it up to the people who stand before the exhibits and the work to do the interpretation.
Any more questions? I have another question.
Sure.
I understand you have a Underground Railroad tour. I do know people that have taken that and said it was very, very informative and interesting. Can you share about that?
Oh, sure. It's a wonderful tour. It's called Journey to Freedom. And it is a National Park Service, Department of the Interior, United States government. I don't want to say blessed, but they've got their seal of approval on it. And there's about 32 sites along that tour. It has also been evolved to include other sites of historical importance for both communities. We used to do it, and Dr. Willie Edwards, who was a former member of this church, she was a member I'm going to think back in the 70s. She passed away, I do believe, in the 90s. And she loved this church. And when she discovered the history of the First Presbyterian Church and the Anti-Slavery Society, it was a strong part of the Underground Railroad tour. And we used to do bus tours at least 4 times a year. But like many organizations who work as volunteers, there's one person who's really good at doing it. Her name is Deborah Meadows. And several people have volunteered to be docents, but as soon as they see the volume of information that you have to learn and absorb, it's hard for them to do. But we pivot. We understand there's nothing like sitting on the bus and driving by and seeing the exterior of some of these places. We're going to do a film about it. And we're going to do a film because that would allow people to go by these places, look at the, not drive and look, but be able to watch it and then go by these places and absorb some of the history. And one of the houses that's on that tour is the Guy Beckley house on Pontiac Trail. And that house on Pontiac Trail is a house where Carolyn Quarles stayed when she had escaped enslavement from Indiana. And Carolyn Quarles was the first African-American woman in that network. I'm not going to try to tell the story because I don't have the details in front of me, and I rely on those for factual representation. What I do know of the story is that when she was a young girl, she was given to her mistress as to be a personal servant. And that was horrible for the mistress because Carolyn Quarles' father was her husband. So every day she looked at this beautiful young lady. You know, at 14, everybody's pretty. And she would look at her and she would watch her in the mirror, combing her hair and doing what 14-year-old girls do. And she decided, she came up behind her one day and she just cut off her hair. And Carolyn knew that was the day she was going to have to leave. She knew that this was not a place for her to stay. So she took her belongings, tied them up, threw them out her bedroom window, took the things that her father gave her. He gave her some beautiful personal care items. He had given her a little bit of money. And the one gift he gave her that helped her cross the ferry was her complexion, because you wouldn't know by looking at her that she was white or black. So she crossed. She arrived in Indiana, and she made her way, along with the other group, to Guy Beckley's house in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And it was also written about in newspapers. And she spent the night there before going on to Detroit and then to Canada for freedom. But Reverend Guy Beckley, and when we do our Underground Railroad tour, sometimes the owner of the Beckley house will come out and read some of the excerpts from the letters that Guy Beckley would write, some of his sermons. And one of his sermons he penned furiously about Ann Arbor, liberal Ann Arbor, not doing enough. Talking the talk, but not walking the walk. It was quite an admonishment about what this city didn't do. So we would tell people, as you are driving along Pontiac Trail and you pass that house, in your mind's eye, you can see Guy Beckley furiously scribbling what he might have written to his congregation, the words he was going to deliver after he had Carolyn Quarles at his house. And that's how we see history working. You know, getting ourselves to immerse ourselves in this experience that we didn't live, but we walk across every day. The farm where the Asher Ray family lived, at Morgan Road and Textile, there is a small cemetery where the black and white families are buried alongside each other. And you can stand in that cemetery. There was a man who ran Cobblestone Farm named George, come to me. And he and I used to talk a lot about the history of Pittsfield Township in that area. And I said to George Taylor, he's passed away. And I said to him one day, George, let's meet out at the cemetery, because I want to stand there and I want you to tell me what was east, what was west, what was north, what was south. So when I look in a direction, I can see and imagine. And he passed away. So part of the lesson I get from that is don't wait and don't hesitate. If somebody doesn't want to tell the story with the hard details that you're asking, many times in African-American families will say, well, we tried to ask them that, but they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't say. I said, well, I find that to be true in almost every family. There's something somebody doesn't want to say, but we're not 10 anymore. We're not 14, we're not 12. We can't be intimidated. Well, maybe, but we can't be totally intimidated by our parents and our grandparents. So ask the question, find the answers, even if the question is, why is it such a hard topic to discuss? And inch by inch. One of my greatest regrets is that my own mother used to say to us, she was very skillful with words, my parents were both journalists, and she would say hanging sentences sort of to keep us in line for another 6 months or 6 years. And she used to always, when she thought we were being difficult to her, not quite getting the parental message, she would say, well, all I know is I hope you all just don't really experience what my mother did. And they were like, well, what was that? Well, you know, I used to ask her about her brother, and all she would tell me is that he broke her mother's heart. I was like, we could never get her to say what it was that he did. Turns out, subsequent family members said he never married the girl that they picked out. But her version was much more dramatic. So, you know, just ask the questions, talk to the people, and talk to your own kids and your grandkids, and let them know what you want them to know about the family history before somebody's flipping through some pictures, randomly assigning names and facts to people they don't even recognize. So that's our personal history that we can do. But as individuals, we can be better for this world and just love on ourselves and people that we care about just a little bit stronger and harder. So, thank you guys so much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation and learning of our own community.
Okay.
We really appreciate it. And this is just a very small token of appreciation for you. And actually, I hope you're inspired us to think about maybe doing the underground tour as a church activity. So we may be in touch with you. I'm at least work through the adult formation session, if not the social action group. So.
Well, that would be great, and I can let Debbie know that this is one that we'll both be doing together. Because we usually do it. We like to do a tandem when it's like a special group that we love. So,
so thank you so much for enlightening us.
Thank you very much.